George Adler, Practical Grammar of the Latin Language. Here's my edition of it. It's rather big because at the time I had this made up, there was only a scan available on Google and not much else. In fact, I had two versions of it. The first was made from Google's first scan, and every 8th page was illegible and had to be rewritten by hand. And with that scan, I started to produce the Adler course in audio. And then I had this printed and bound. Of course, now you don't need to do this anymore. You can just go online, and it's easy to find copies of Adler's text as a reprint. But it wasn't the case in 2007. So we're going to start with Pensum Alterum, the second chapter. The first chapter I'm going to pretty much ignore. Regarding the first declension. The first declension is made up of all substantives, those are nouns, and adjectives, which describe the nouns, which form their genitive in I. Now the genitive is the case in English that takes the apostrophe S, so kings, books. The nominative of these words, that's the word itself, that's what we think of the nominative. Those ones that are purely Roman in origin end in the letter A, A. And you'll notice that Adler uses a tiny little U above the A. This tells us it's a short sound, A, not A. And that of a few Greek words in E is a long line over the letter. This is called a macron, and the little U is called a breve. The macron tells us that the sound is long. So we have E and E. There's a slight difference in quality in these sounds. We can approximate the Roman vowels, but we don't know, except for A, the letter A, where there's pretty much unanimous agreement among all the scholars. For all the other vowels, we have a ballpark range, and as long as we're within that ballpark range, we should be satisfied. There's some people who are hyper-perfectionists, but as there are no Romans to listen to, we can't get too extremist about it. And also, we know even in Roman times, within the actual city of Rome, there were different versions of the pronunciation. We are aiming at the pronunciation of educated Romans who lived on the Palatine Hill around about the time of the end of the Republic and the early Caesars. That's what we're aiming for, but of course there are no Romans to talk to, so we can't get it perfect. However much some people might like to believe that they can. So the nominative of each of these words, as are of purely Roman origin, ends in A, and that of the few Greek words in the first declension, E, Es, and As, like lampadas, meaning a lamp. Those in A and E are mostly feminine, because Latin words have got gender. They are treated as though they are male or female. And the rest are masculine, that is male. The singular of a noun, a, in connection with mea, meaning my, and tua, meaning your. So let's have a look at this. My paper, mea kaharta, mea kaharta. My papers, or of my paper, you'd say meai kahartai. To or for my paper, also meai kahartai. My paper, when we are doing something to it, so I see my paper, I tear my paper, I burn my paper. There's a verb acting on the paper, and so we use what's called the accusative. You can think of it as a hand pointing from the verb at the noun. It's accusing it. And so it changes. Meam kahartam. Notice the way the M is pronounced there. It's not meam kahartam, but the M simply nasalizes the last vowel. So when you're reading Latin poetry, for example, a word that ends in an M is actually ending in a vowel. And so if it's followed by another word that begins with a vowel, They elide or slide into each other. It's not as though the Roman has crossed the M out. The M was never there. It's simply a sign of nasalization of the final vowel. Mea kaharta. Oh, my paper. If you get excited and you want to talk to your paper, you say, oh, my paper. Right? You go here and you take your paper and you go, oh, my paper, I love you. Right? Not likely to happen, is it? Unless it's your PhD thesis. So, mea kaharta. And with or by my paper, by means of my paper. So, I killed him with my paper. You would say, I killed him mea kaharta. Right? I killed him by means of my paper. Could happen. Now let's do the same thing again with tua, meaning your. It's exactly the same, just different word. Your table, tua mensa. Of your table, tuae mensai. To or for your table, tuae mensai. Your table, tuam mensam. O your table, tua mensa. And with or from or by means of your table, tua mensa. The A of the first declension is always long. This in the ablative. So if you're killing someone by means of the paper, right? I kill you, mea kaharta, by means of my paper. That final A is always long. And it's sometimes printed with a little circumflex or hat over it in older Latin texts. So if you start to read Renaissance texts, you'll often find that helpfully the printer has put a little circumflex over the final ablative of first declension nouns. But they don't do it for other forms because it's more clear what's going on. But in all other cases of words declined, the final A is generally short, as in kaharta, candelabra, templa, temples. Candelabra is a plural, right? Candlesticks. Templa is a plural, temples. Now, if you are looking at Adler's book, you need to be careful because in the book he doesn't give the quantities of the terminations of words. He assumes you've learned the rules and you can supply those quantities yourself. So you have to keep an eye open if you're using Adler's textbook. Let's have a look at how the book begins. He starts off with some questions, because the whole book builds up as a series of questions and answers. Have you got? Habesne. Habesne. And here we notice something about Latin. It is tonal. The Roman grammarians describe this at great length. And these tones have come down into the Romance languages. So when an Italian says amare, that are sound comes straight from Latin. So habesne, do you have? There's a circumflex accent over the E. Habesne, the tone goes up and it goes down. Generally at the end of words we have a falling or flat tone, and at some point in the word we'll have an accent that goes up and acute. As in this case, num habes, do you not have? Num habes. When we start a question with num, we expect the answer to be no. Then we have an idiomatic form, est ne tibi. Is it not to you? Est ne tibi. An habes, do you have? So there are various ways of saying do you have. And yes, sir, I have, which is how you must always talk to me. Call me sir. You say, it est domine habeo. Yes, sir, I have. It est domine habeo. Notice we write ita est, but we actually say itast or itest. Right? We elide the vowel. So we'll find in Plautus itast. Yes. We should never just say ita by itself. Ita means thus, and ita est means thus it is. So if we're responding in the affirmative, saying yes to the answer of a question, we mustn't use ita as though it were equal to the English word yes. It's not. And you do find this with people that are trying to speak Latin, that they start saying ita. I don't know where this habit started from, but it's a bad one. Ita est domine habeo. Or you can say, sane quidem domine est. Yes, indeed, sir, it is. Notice when you talk to we have a dominus, that's the master. When you talk to the master, it becomes domine. You can think of this in this way. We have 5 types of words in Latin. Words the first type end in a. Words the second type, dominus is an example of that. Only words of a second type use the pointing finger. So when you talk to somebody in a word of a second type, it changes from us to e, but doesn't for all the others. So the others stay the same, just if it ends in a us, words of a second type. Now, this famous word, the famous sentence, habesne pilium. Do you have a hat? Habesne pilium. Or you can say, estne tibi pileus. Notice that with est, it is to you a hat. We use the nominative, the actual form of the word, without changing it. Estne tibi pileus, because there's the hat, it is to you. But habesne pilium, do you have a hat? Right? It's not just is the hat in existence, but there's a verb, the verb have, that's acting on the hat, and so the hat is then in the accusative. Right? We have a bang. We have a verb that is acting on the hat. Right? So habesne pilium. Do you have a hat? And the answer, yes, sir, I have a hat. Sic est domine habeo pilium. Sic est domine habeo pilium. Or we could say, etiam domine est mihi pilius. Right? So etiam domine, another way of saying yes. The Romans had many, many different ways of asking questions and many ways of answering them. Far more ways of asking a question than we have in English. And there are lots of subtleties involved in the way Romans asked questions. In asking questions, just reading the footnote at the bottom of page 8, the Romans usually employed certain signs of interrogation, of which the most common are the enclitic, that's a word that sticks onto the end of a word, like it's glued there. Ne. So habes ne. That ne tells us it's a question. Ne. And the accent moves to just before it. Habes ne. It's always stuck on the end of a verb. It can also be stuck on some other word as well. It doesn't have to be on the end of the verb. And also we have little particles num, meaning do you not, an, equid, numquid, utrum, nonne, and we'll be learning more about these later in the course. Or you will if you proceed with the course. The enclitic ne and equid can be used in questions of every single description. Any type of question can be used. But that's when the answer is expected by the questioner to be a positive answer or a negative answer. You don't know what the answer is going to be. Num and numquid are only used when the answer is going to expected to be no. So it's sort of a kind of rhetorical-ish question. You expect a no answer. Nonne is only used when you're expecting someone to say yes. Like, have you done your homework? Right? That kind of question. An and utrum, chiefly in double questions, whether you have this or that. Another little note. The most current Latin adverbs that correspond to our English yes, because we have a problem with this. The Romans did not have a word for yes. pesky language, this Latin. They would say etiam, meaning even or even so. They would say vero, meaning indeed. Recte, meaning you're right. Certe, certainly. And then we have ita, not very often, usually ita est, itast. Sic est, thus it is so. Sane, indeed or surely. Sane quidem, yes indeed, yes surely. And then we have this word immo, which is extremely hard to translate. It's almost completely untranslatable. And indeed, in Latin translations, the translators, sly beasts that they are, just ignore it. But it's there, it's a very important part of Latin. It just doesn't transfer across very easily into English. So immo, vero, which is just yes and yes, yes, but it's not really. It's the Romans frequently reply by a simple repetition of the verb, and this is the most common way a Roman will answer a question. Do you have the hat? I have. Right? Do you have the hat or the pen? The hat. Right? That's how Romans tended to answer questions. So they frequently reply to a simple repetition with a simple repetition of the verb, or with the emphatic word of the inquiry. So in these questions, with a simple habeo, est ne tibi pilleus? Est. Right? Habes ne pillium? Habeo. Nice and simple and sweet. Also note that sir, the address sir, which is used in English schools sometimes. Yes, sir. No, sir. 3 bags full, sir. The Romans didn't really have an equivalent. But we're just going to use dominus, domine, master. It'll do. Also note, the Romans have no article. There's no word for the or for a or an. Sometimes the demonstrative pronoun this one, that one is used instead for emphasis, or someone, or unus, one. But ordinarily, in the normal way of speaking, distinctions that we express with our articles were mentally supplied by the context. Indeed, the Romans used context an enormous amount when they wrote. Yep. Right. The verb habeo, as I said before, it's what we call a transitive verb. The action passes across. So habeo pillium. Habeo pillium, the action of having passes across to the hat. And so the hat is followed by, the hat becomes accusative. An accusative hat when it is had. With the verb est, which is a neuter verb, now this word neuter, each the e and the u are pronounced separately, according to Allen in Vox Latina. So neuter, which in English we say neuter, is followed by the nominative, because the verb doesn't activate the pointing hand. Let's look at some vocabulary. The pen, here's one, a pen. This is a 2nd century word from Isidore of Seville. This is the first time we used it. Penna, pennai. So the Romans in the time of their republic didn't use this word as far as we know. They may have. It's certainly it's just not attested in the literature until the 2nd century. This doesn't mean that it wasn't being used, just that in none of the surviving books that have come down to us, of which there are not that many, the word isn't there. Doesn't tell us very much. We can't actually say how frequent things are in Roman times because we don't have enough literature. Penna, pennai. It's feminine. So pennai is pens, apostrophe s, and penna, the pen itself. Ribbon. Ribbon, tainia tiny I. And we also have fascia, fasciae, also feminine. The table, mensa, mensai. So mensa, the table, mensai, tables, apostrophe S. Paper, kaharta. Now notice CH. When the Romans did write something CH, they were telling us, firstly, this is a Greek loan word, most of the time. Sometimes it would be Hebrew. And it's aspirated. So it's not karta, but it's karta with a slight sound. I'm slightly overemphasizing it for the sake of your spelling, of course. And when I read Latin, I also make a point of making my H clear. As Alan says, when an H appears in Latin, in a modern text anyway, we should pronounce it because we don't really know any better, and we should stick to pronouncing our H's. So, kaharta, kahartai. Kahartai, papers, kaharta, paper. That's papers, apostrophe S. A hat, or the hat. Pileus, pileus, pilei. And this is masculine. And the accusative, pileum, habeo, pileum, pileum, habeo. Sugar, saccharum, saccharum. And in the genitive form, saccari, saccari. And this is a neuter word, which means that its raw form and its accusative form are the same. Salt is a word that's got two genders, so it can be sal and then salis, which is salts, apostrophe S, and the accusative salem. It also occurs in the neuter. If it's neuter, that means the raw form of the word, the nominative, and the accusative form are going to be the same. So we have sal and the accusative sal, and the genitive, which is the apostrophe S, salis, salts. So words that are neuter gender, the neuter is a sub-form of the masculine. So it has most of the forms of the masculine, but the nominative, the accusative are the same. The vocative is going to be the same. It's the same anyway in all of them except for words on the second type. I'm not being rude, I'm just being grammatical. So, words of neuter gender have the nominative, accusative, vocative, singular and plural always the same. So let's have a look at this. Meus. Meus means my. Meus. In the nominative, masculine, meus. Feminine, mea. And the neuter, meum. In the accusative, when I have mine, right? I have, pointing at it, mine. So I have meum. If it's a feminine thing, it would be meam. And if it's a neuter thing, meum. So I have my hat, you'd say meum. If it's my table that you have, which is feminine, meam. And if it's your candlestick that you have, it would be meum. Your, in the nominative, tuus for the masculine, tua for the feminine, and tuum for the neuter. So your hat be tuus. Your table would be tua, and your candlestick would be tuum. And in the accusative, tuum for the masculine, tuam for the feminine, and tuum for the neuter. A rule, adjectives and adjective pronouns, such as the ones we just saw here. My is an adjective pronoun. My hat is describing the hat, so it's an adjective pronoun. Adjectives and adjective pronouns agree with their noun substantives in gender and in number and in case. Gender, masculine and feminine. Number, singular or plural. That's all we have in language, singular and plural for numbers. If you were to speak Hebrew, you would also have dual, things that come in natural pairs, but in Latin we don't have that. And case, that is, whether it's one of these different things we spoke about. My paper, of my paper, to my paper, for my paper, etc. Let's have a look at some examples here. My sugar, meum saccharum. My hat, in the nominative, pilius meus, because it's male. And in the neuter form, because pilium also exists as a neuter form, pilium meum. In the accusative, pilium meum, or we can say meum pilium, we can put them either way. My pen, for the nominative, that's the raw form of the word, mea penna, or we can say penna mea. And in the accusative, I have my pen when it's being acted on by a verb. I break my pen, I burn my pen. Meam pennam, pennam meam. Your salt, salt is a nominative, sal tum, and for the accusative, sal tum, or we can put it the other way around and say tum sal. Do you have my hat? Habesne meum pilium. And the answer, yes sir, I have your hat. Verro, domine, pilium tuum habeo. Do you have my ribbon? Habesne, tiniam meam. And I have your ribbon. Habeo, tuam, tiniam. I have your ribbon. Do you have the pen? Or do you have a pen? Estne tibi penna. Now notice penna has got two ends. We don't say pen-na with a break between them, but we do distinctly pronounce pen, one syllable, and na, the other syllable. The first syllable is closed, pen-na. But we don't actually have to break the word up. In the, if you listen to the recordings I made, I was overemphasizing this, I think. So when you, I assume you do, purchase the Adler course. That's very, very cheap. And it's over at latinum.org.uk. You will find the first 4 lessons that when I give this word penna, I'm slightly overemphasizing this just to get it into your head what we do with double consonants in English. If you are an Italian speaker or whatever, you will have no problem with this. You'd naturally do it anyway. Estne tibi penna or habesne pennam. I have the pen, or I have a pen. Est mihi penna, or habeo pennam. So that's the end of the lesson. And then we have something that Adler does. He firstly gives a translation exercise, which is in the textbook. And I would advise you to actually do the translations. So exercise 1, he gives it, have you the table, slightly stilted English. Firstly, because Adler was a native German speaker. Here he is writing a textbook in English, and he's basing it on a textbook that was designed by Henri Ollendorff. Henri Ollendorff made up this method, and all that Adler did, Ollendorff actually wrote the first Latin-French version of this textbook that we have of Adler's book. Adler would have had Ollendorff's French-Latin version. He didn't like Ollendorff's Latin very much, so he rewrote the whole thing, and he added in lots of grammatical notes. But the structure of the textbook is an Ollendorff. In other words, we are proceeding through Latin in this method designed by Henri Ollendorff, which he ripped off from Jean Manesca. These things happen in the academic world. And so we have it. So, yeah, you find that the English is a bit peculiar, which is why the audio course I produced is quite important, because I don't just read Adler's book, I reinterpret it in updated modern English-ish. Because I think I speak modern modern-ish English. Although things are changing so fast nowadays, often I have to ask teenagers to interpret what they're saying to me, because I really don't understand what they're trying to say. Especially those from East London. Habesne mensam. Habesne mensam. This part I'm not going to translate anything, because we're just revising what we've learned already. Etiam domine mensam habio. Habesne mensam meam. Mensam tuam habio. Habesne pennam tuam. Pennam meam habio. Habesne saccharum. Saccharum habio. Habesne saccharum meum. Saccharum tuum habio. Habesne cahartam. Cahartam habeo. Habesne cahartam tuam. Cahartam meam habeo. Habesne sal. Sal habeo. Now I'm just going to break quickly here. This word habeo, interestingly enough, the E in habeo, I read a long academic discussion on this, for the Romans was closer to the letter I. And we know this because there are lots of misspellings in Roman texts. Uneducated Romans give us a lot of hints about pronunciation because they misspelled things according to how they heard them. And so habeo, in this context where the b, e, o, the E is followed by an O, pushes the E from an e sound towards a more closed I sound. And anyway, we know that the short E and the short I were closer to each other in some ways than the open long sounds. So sal habeo, it's more like habio than habeo. If you are saying sal habeo with a strong S sound, you're being hyper-correct, and that's not how a Roman would have pronounced it. So, cahartam meam habeo. Habesne sal, sal habeo. Habesne sal meum, sal tuum habeo. And now I'm going to repeat all this using the neuter verb est. And of course, if we use est, then we have the nominative. Estne tibi mensa, est mihi mensa. Estne tibi mensa mea, est mihi mensa tua. Estne tibi penna tua, est mihi penna mea. Estne tibi saccharum, est mihi saccharum. Estne tibi saccharum meum, est mihi saccharum tuum. Estne tibi caharta, est mihi caharta. Estne tibi caharta tua, est mihi caharta mea. Estne tibi sal, est mihi sal. Estne tibi sal meum, est mihi sal tuum. And that's the end of the first lesson from Adler's Latin course. The entire course I've recorded in audio. There are over 200 hours of audio in the Latin course. What I did was I took Adler's book, I recorded it, so we have it broken up into sections. The first 4 lessons are broken in a slightly different way, and after that we have section A and B and C. A is the grammar. B, I give over in Latin, English, Latin, the example exercises and all the examples that are brought up in the chapter. And then in section C, I just do the material in Latin only, the questions and the answers. Firstly, very slowly, and then I repeat it more quickly. And if you work your way through the Latin course, you will absorb an enormous amount of Latin. You don't actually have to write anything down. What I did, simply to activate my Latin in the way I wanted to activate it so that I would become a thinker in Latin and not a translator of Latin, I recorded Adler's textbook, and this is an enormous book, as you can see. It's rather compendious, and the typeface is rather small. So if this were a modern book, it would comprise probably 3 or 4 volumes of this size, because we don't print books with that kind of tiny typeface anymore. Plus, we have the dictata, which also are very dense, and nowadays we wouldn't print things in such a small typeface, so this would be a book double the size. All in all, we have about 1,000 pages of textbook. To that, I added many, many more paradigms. So when we have verbs, I give lots of examples. I conjugate all of the examples that Adler gives. So there's a lot more material in the audio course than is in the actual textbook. And you simply need to listen. Plug it into your headphones and start to listen. And that, in and of itself, will build up your Latin, especially going through the grammar a couple of times. I think the grammar is important to listen to. It's far more important to listen to the examples. You learn through the examples, not through the rules. And go over section B, section C, and then there's a review at the end of the whole thing. There's a review of the whole course, of all of the dictata, and that you just need to listen to regularly. Even now, I still put on Adler's dictata revision, and I listen through the whole thing. I try to do that reasonably regularly. And I also, although the recording I made isn't absolutely perfect, it's good enough, I listened to the Rippmann vocabulary at least once a month to keep on building up my native vocabulary. I've reread Comenius's Orbis Sensualium Pictus who knows how many times, many, many times, and I've listened to it countless times. I find it far, far easier to listen to a text repeatedly than to pick up the book and read it over 50 times. Because to become fluent, you need an enormous amount of input, thousands of hours of it, and you're not going to get that from reading text. If you aim, and my aim is to become as fluent as I can be so that I can pick up any text and have to look at the dictionary probably as often as I need to when I'm reading an English text. It does happen when I'm reading English books. I need to look up a dictionary sometimes. I aim to get my Latin up to that level, certainly for reading, and for speaking, well, so-so. It's not as important. Speaking is a tool for activating the language to help you become a better reader. And maybe in 10 years down the line, I will count myself as a fluent speaker of Latin. It takes time. At the moment, if you look at where things are compared to how scholars were in the 16 and 1700s, then most of us are lagging very, very far behind, and we have a lot of catch-up to do, which is why I'm focusing a lot on these 16th century texts, because they set the bar quite high. Adler codifies something. He codifies a method of learning, and I think it's a brilliant, brilliant method. My Latin, what there is of it, comes from Adler. So if you want to get as good as me, or better, I'm not that good, I would really suggest that you listen to my Adler course. It isn't expensive. Each section of lessons is $1.99, and the whole course will take you a couple of years to get through, maybe 1 year if you really are obsessive about it, and it will be very useful to you. I know that many people who've studied Latin for many years have found the Adler course has activated their Latin, which until that point was passive. It's broken them out of the habit of searching for the verb, of actually trying to dissect a Latin sentence to understand it, to get to the point of just being able to read it as you go, like a Roman did. So that's it. A reminder before I sign off that if you press like on one of my videos, that means that the way YouTube is now set up, it then goes onto your feed, and then other people can find it more easily. So I'd ask you please to press like, even if you don't like it, if you think that the lesson is useful, valuable, and should be spread around. Vale, bye. And latinum.org.uk for my stuff. Bye bye.